Welcome everyone. I'm Aideen and this is our voice and song session for May 2023. And our topic today is how to like your voice, how to find your voice, and how to be kind about your voice because I'm not sure if anybody just loves their own voice all the time. That would be a tough act to follow. So I'd like to introduce our experts today. We will be chatting about this topic for a little while, and then we will go into breakout rooms and our Q&A at the end. So welcoming Ziza Natur all the way from Bucharest, Romania. I got that right this time, I hope.
Yes, you did. Thank you, Aideen. Nice to see you and nice to see everyone.
Yeah, it's great to have you here way. And then all the way from Melbourne, Australia, Carolyn Baker at 11 p.m. at night.
Hello.
You work late sometimes, right?
I sure do. Midnight to 6 a.m. is my go.
Well, we're here now, and just before we came on and started recording, I was admitting how much I'm not liking the tone and sound of my speaking voice right now because I was at a party last night and I slept in, didn't sleep great actually either, and I rolled out of bed and got ready for this meeting. And I haven't spoken much yet today. My voice doesn't sound the way it usually sounds when it's more warmed up. So, Ziza, do you have any advice for someone like me that feels like, my voice sounds awful? What do I do?
Well, I'm going to give you the same advice that I gave to myself today because I was in the same situation. In my case, it's a little bit of hay fever and not being able to sleep for about 3 days because of my sinuses. So my voice was the same in the morning. It just did not sound good. And I had some voice training sessions with my students and I was like, oh my God, I can't do the exercises properly. But then I thought you have to give yourself compassion and grace because I think the voice is a living being. It's not going to be the same every day. And there are so many factors that can influence the way it sounds. And we cannot change all of them all the time. Sometimes you don't sleep well. Sometimes you have an allergy. Sometimes even in females' bodies, changes happen that affect the voice. So I think the most important advice that I could give you is to give yourself compassion and grace and patience because you're doing your best right now.
Yes, and even if I'm pretending to be a voice, even if I am a voice expert, my voice doesn't have to sound perfect all the time. I love that advice. Carolyn, what do you think?
I completely agree with Ziza and yourself. You know, there's so many factors in a day, you know, not even mentioning emotions. Your emotions can change your voice immensely, and your physical cycles, whether you're a male in the 3-month cycle or a female in the 1-month cycle. You know, our voices change, and so and pitch wise they change in that cycle as well. So there's literally life affects our voice and our voice affects our life, and so yeah, we just have to be with it where it's at, and like you were saying, Ziza, have compassion and grace for ourselves. You know, and I think the more advanced or the more professional you are, the harder you are on yourself, and that's a space we've got to be aware of.
Yeah,
especially
whether you're
in
singing
the
or
of the music
speaking, right?
industry. Yeah,
very good. Yes, so there is that moment though where I'm going, oh, my voice, here I am hosting the session and my own voice is not what I would like it to be. So what else can affect the voice? I mean, do you guys have any other insights on how what could be causing our voice to be so different from day to day?
What we eat, what we
Yes.
drink. There are certain foods that can cause mucus. Maybe you're smoking even passively or at a party, that one can cause mucus as well. That can affect your voice. So all of the things that we ingest, maybe you have some sort of an allergy or intolerance that's mild, that one can affect the voice as well. The temperature of the foods and the drinks that you eat and drink, that one affects the voice as well. So it's super sensitive. I mean, it's a very sensitive muscle, and we know that muscles have a certain performance or less performance depending on what we feed them with. So that influences too.
Absolutely. And speaking of the food, I mean, I know that if we don't drink enough water, maybe I'm a little dehydrated after being out at, at a party last night. So it's one of the most delicate organs, I think, that, we have air passing by all the time. And then if there's any sinus, kind of mucus, we can have that little nasal drip down the back of the throat. And so everything's passing by the vocal folds. And Carolyn, I know that you're a vocal health expert. You have anything to add?
Well, yeah, the weather really affects it. And depending on what altitude you live at really affects it.
Oh.
And if you think about where people sing, they sing in any type of weather. They sing inside, outside, in heat, in cold. Having a heater on makes your voice dry. Having the cooler on makes your voice dry. So, absolutely everything affects the voice. And I think if we acknowledge that and realize that the voice is the most vulnerable instrument out of all the instruments, then we can give ourselves more grace, but also be much more kinesthetically aware of what's happening to our voice in the different spaces where we are. So if you can gain one skill, just one, with singing, it's to become kinesthetically, physically aware of what is happening internally for yourself, and emotionally and mentally and spiritually, because all of it affects the voice. It's, yeah, like what I said a moment ago about life affects our voice and the voice affects our life. It's so true in every aspect, because everything will affect your voice and everything in your voice will affect your life. And so learning how to let your voice, learning how to be at peace with your voice and letting it move through different spaces will actually help you as a person move through different spaces in your life, whether it's grief or joy or coming down off a high or getting ready for an exciting thing that's coming up, and realizing what's going on holistically will help your voice immensely and your life.
Yeah. I actually I almost lost my singing voice completely at one point. And I must talk about this a little more, because I had been working in the airline industry for 5 years and hadn't done hardly any singing. And anytime I left a job, I always said I left it because I wanted to do more singing. It was like I never left a job that wasn't taking me one step closer to hopefully singing. And this time I said, okay, at least I can join a choir. I could take a singing lesson, because I knew it had been a while since I had done anything. So I had a job. I was working in recruitment in Dublin, in Ireland, and I was working in a place called Fitzwilliam Square, and it was quite far from the school that I wanted to take lessons in. And the only time the teacher could take me was at lunch, on my lunch break. So I used to run there, almost like walked. I walked there really fast. But the funny thing was the audition to get in. Now, I was working in recruitment. I had a headset, I had KPIs. That was the first time I ever heard about KPIs, key performance indicators. And I had to call at least, 25 people a day, like a certain amount of companies, a certain amount of clients. And then I had to set up a certain number of interviews every single week, and da 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 da. So I just had to keep this momentum going. And I was always on the phone trying to convince people something. And I didn't know how my singing voice was, because I hadn't been singing. I was like, okay, I'm going to the singing audition. It's good. I'll see what happens. She got me singing and I only could sing 5 notes. I was so shocked, because I knew I was able to sing more before. And I was embarrassed. I was upset. And I just looked at her, I was like, and she said, I think there's a good voice in there. I was like, really? And then she said, I think I'll take you on. And I was like, oh, thank God, because this was for me the biggest thing that made me feel more myself. It was like this part of me that I was either suppressing or, not using quite often during my life. It mattered to me so much. And her telling me that she thought there was a good voice in there meant the world to me that moment. So, I mean, coming back from that and learning to find high notes again and low notes and to sing, sweetly again, that was a bit of a journey for me. But that was a shock, I have to say. Has anything like that happened to you, Ziza, or something similar?
Yeah, it happened to me twice before going on stage. I completely lost my voice. Once it happened because of a physical reason. I've had an allergic reaction to a cough syrup I took. And the second time was because of an emotional reason. Just as Carolyn said, emotions have a very strong influence. I saw someone in backstage whom I really didn't want them to be there. And I got so upset that my throat contracted all of a sudden and I couldn't make a single sound. And the emergency solution was just to take about 4 pills of calcium or something like that, just to relax the vocal cords. And I could sing in the lower pitch area of the song, and the rest of it I just spoke it and completely changed the structure so I can finish with the song, because I had to go on stage in 5 minutes and I couldn't sing anymore. It was just awful. And I also had vocal nodules 10 years ago, and that one was a combination of two reasons. On one hand, I wasn't using the correct voice technique, and on the other hand, I was keeping everything to myself. I was that kind of person who would never express what they really wanted. And I would feel that lump in my throat whenever something upset me, and I kept it and kept it and kept it to myself until it became something physical. And that's when I realized that my whole career can be compromised if I don't make changes. So yeah, it can happen.
Wow. Oh, thank you for sharing that, Ziza. I didn't know you went through that. That was hard, I bet.
Oh yeah, I've spent 1 month in silence while I was doing the treatment. So I didn't make one word. I was just writing everything and waving my hands. It was a huge lesson for me.
So was vocal rest enough for your nodules to?
And I also had some insulin shots. It was a very low dosage of insulin that was meant to melt the nodules, but just because they weren't extremely advanced, wasn't that severe. The doctor said we need to avoid surgery as much as we can, so this might work, and I'm happy it did.
Thank God. Yeah. Thank goodness. Thank you. And Ziza, I'm so happy you worked with your voice now. It's funny how I think whoever works with voice, they've had their own version of the struggle, and it's that struggle that really has brought us and made us more dedicated to this, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Carolyn?
Well, that was actually my story too. That's what propelled me into vocal health. So I was singing and speaking in schools from 5-year-olds to 19-year-olds, 5 days a week. And I was teaching singing outside of that. And I was public speaking. And all of a sudden I got a cold, just a normal cold. And I kept singing on it for the next 6 weeks, teaching public speaking on it because they were my jobs. And then I said, something's wrong. This is not getting better. And so I went to a vocal health expert, and she said to me, if you don't stop for 12 weeks, you're never going to sing again. And it was terrifying, to be honest. It was very, very scary. And I laugh because I laugh about most things, even extreme pain. So it was probably the most frightening thing that I ever experienced, because every part of my training had been to do with my voice. Every part of my work had to do with my voice. And so I had to, in that 12 weeks, completely surrender and I prayed a lot and tried to figure out who I was if I didn't have my voice anymore. But in the process, I learned a lot about vocal health, and I became passionate about vocal health to the point where now everything that I teach is about vocal health and vocal health techniques, so people can have vocal freedom with the boundary of vocal health, with the spontaneity of muscle isolation. so that they can have the sound that they want when they want it in a healthy way. But the reality is, as anyone that uses their voice a lot, you will have some vocal trauma at some point. Just like an athlete will, run and run and run, and then their ankle will get sore and they'll have to rest and they'll have to do exercises. It's the same with the voice. And so having those techniques in place is really important. And thankfully, after that 12 weeks, I was able to get back to everything that I was doing. But then I had the grounding of vocal foundations, vocal health, and that propelled me strongly. But then I also went and did training in pastoral care in hospitals, where I learned how to listen and be silent. And that was invaluable. So yeah, those two together, very important.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. 12 whole weeks. I know I've done it to myself when I was, inexperienced and was learning about different strategies, like to sing loudly. And I remember trying this one thing and I thought I knew what I was doing. I had no clue. And I just practiced it the wrong way for about a week and a half. And then my voice wasn't the same for 6 weeks. It just sounded different. And I have had a student as well, absolute beginner, like singer, like just did a 6-week course with me, and her voice had transformed within the 6 weeks. And I was really looking forward to her performance. And of course, the day before the performance, she decided to get on a bouncy castle slide. Like, I can imagine a slide can be scary, but a bouncy castle slide. And she screamed, and her voice was just not the same the following day. It was completely different. So we can, sometimes just in being unaware of the type of impact that the way we use our voice, the way we eat, overuse can be very, very, very difficult for the voice as well, because it's like the human body. And like you said, the sports analogy is absolutely perfect. If you're using your voice a lot, it's like a performance. It's a skill that you need to protect, and that can easily be hurt. And then you need to just tending to. I like to use the word tend. I need to tend to it. I was curious though, Carolyn, you mentioned something earlier, and I don't know if anybody else picked this up. You said the women have a 1-month cycle and the men have a 3-month cycle. Would you care to explain this concept? Because I've never heard of this. Anybody else in the room ever heard of that? I don't think so. We're getting a lot of nods to get you back to talk about that.
Okay, well, we all know about the 1-month cycle for females. But, that can be different for females too. It depends, if your cycle is regular or irregular, or what stage of life you're in. If you've gone through perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause. So our voices change all the way through. But for men have cycles as well, and it isn't talked about very much. But just like for females, they will have an emotional cycle. For some men, it can be 6 weeks. For some men, it can be 12. And there'll be times in that 6-week or 12-week cycle where their voice will dip lower. And when it will come back, there will be times where they will feel anger and frustration. And I would say not the word teariness, but more on the verge of tears. And yes,
Is
for
that
example,
caused by hormones the same way that the women's cycle is?
Yeah, it's still a hormonal cycle.
Okay.
But it isn't talked about a lot, because sometimes emotions can be on the hush.
Yes.
For men, sometimes.
Yes.
I'm trying to be very careful about how I speak, Chris.
It's okay if men cry from time to time, Carolyn. We don't mind.
Oh, absolutely. My dad was the crier in our family. So I don't have any issues with men being emotional, because my dad is pretty awesome.
He showed you how it's done.
He did. He taught me that it was okay to feel pain and to talk about it. And I think, if anything, my mother was my mum was the one who was like, okay, this is a situation, let's gather everybody in and let's walk everyone forward, and I'll deal with my own emotions later, and a bit of denial. And then my dad would be like, we have to talk about the emotions, we're going through it, let's talk about it. So I had a bit of a different experience to some others, but both were incredibly important. And so I felt like I got the best of both worlds there, you know, talk about the emotions, but also let's gather everyone together and let's move forward together. And
they're
but
both
yes,
strategies
cycle definitely for men
to cope.
Yeah.
When you're talking
and
about cycles,
you can look it up as well.
oh
'Cause
yeah,
men
this is what I wanted to ask. Do you have anything anywhere that you would recommend people look it up? And I'm presuming that that it has to do with testosterone dipping, is it?
Yes, well, we all know that men's voices changes. Men's voices change. Yes.
That's it.
Between 14 and 18. But because of those changes, that big testosterone kick is 600 to 800 times stronger in those teenage years than any other time in their life, but they still have testosterone kicks as life keeps going. And so just like females will have different stages in their life, and their voices will change in different stages of their life. So even when you're pregnant, your vocal folds swell, and then when they come back together, they have already stretched, so they'll naturally be deeper depending on how many children that you may have had. And so I always found that fascinating. And so so there's so many changes in the human life that will impact the voice, and even trauma. So if trauma happens in a voice, like what you were saying, Ziza, about, you know, seeing somebody that you didn't want to see, and the voice just going in protective mode, because the primary purpose of the voice is to protect the airways. And if you sense that you're in a dangerous situation or some fear comes up, your voice will change. And same as if you feel joyful. So, but on top of those, there is the normal hormonal cycle that we all have. But I actually don't have any links for the male one. It was something that I read about years and years ago that I found fascinating. But I can't remember where I read it, unfortunately. But I will check, and I will send you any information that I find.
That would be great. And I know that there's a lot of research being done now on gender, and, you know, even transgender voices, and people who just want to change their voices because of how they want to be identified. So that's something that we might have something about in our next summit, because I'd like the next summit to talk a little bit on some of these points. So we'll see how that goes. And
that creates a whole stack of different spaces, because if you're wanting your voice to be deeper and it's naturally higher, then you can create vocal problems. Or if it's lower and you want it to be higher, then that will create vocal problems. And so there has to be a process.
Absolutely. Well, I studied jazz music, so of course I wanted to sound like Ella Fitzgerald, even though I sound more like I sounded more like a you know, like a sweet 10-year-old. People kept saying, "Oh, you have a beautiful young voice," and I'd be like, "I thought I was 35. I wonder why they're saying I have a beautiful young voice." But there are things you can do with larynx position that will, but it's almost like we need to be cautious when we try to be something we're not naturally, and just develop new choices for our voice as we practice with the right help, I think.
Yeah. And that's the vocal spontaneity, the muscle isolation, because you can move absolutely everything in your larynx separately, apart from the cricoid that has to move with the thyroid, but everything else can move separately, which creates the different sounds that you can make.
I love that.
I love that.
That's what I say.
Sorry, I'll let you talk.
No, it's great. I want you to talk. I love you when you talk here. But yeah, it's about choices, right? But not every vocal coach understands all of that. So it's something that I have a little bit of an interest in, and I understand, but different coaches have more, or, you know, depending on how long they've been aware of the minute physiology of the voice. I just wanted to mention what's been going on in the chat. John says, I watched the film Interstellar the other night and cried from beginning to end. That is very nice. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Chris says, great movie. So I would, what are the warning signs of vocal injury? We have a question here. Aziza?
Oh, I will say that you can feel that there's something going on. So it will probably be like this feeling of constriction around your throat, or it literally hurts, like when you're having a sore throat, when you're sick, it's the same pain, or sometimes it even feels a little bit ticklish if you're having some allergies or something. It feels, usually when the voice is okay, you don't feel anything. So if something feels off, this is an indicator that something is going on there. And of course, like we've previously discussed, the causes can be different, but I would say this is the first sign. You can feel it in your body that something's going on there, and then you can hear it. If you have a hoarse voice, you're gonna know something happened over there.
For sure. And I know sometimes if I would warn people to be careful if they start to feel like they want to cough or they feel tightness, because it's almost like the voice is going, hey, don't do that to me. You have to be aware.
Yeah. And I think it's important to mention this one here, because not everyone might know this, but COVID can affect your voice quite a lot. And this happened to me last year. And if you felt that your voice wasn't the same after COVID, you're not crazy, because it took me about 9 months to get my voice back to its normal state. I would get a hoarse voice after 10 minutes of singing. And it was just awful because I couldn't do my work properly. And I would get it back after 3 or 4 hours of just sitting in silence, but it was awful because it took so long to get it back in shape. So if you've been feeling like your voice is not as it used to be, just be patient, because it's a long recovery.
Carolyn?
I completely agree with that. I actually, after having COVID, I tried stacks of different ways, and all of the vocal health trauma healing techniques that I could for 6 months, and I couldn't sing above an F above middle C without coughing. I could sing lower without coughing, but anything above F, and I just could not cough. And honestly, the only thing that changed it was I went to church and someone prayed for me. And the next day I had my entire range back. It was like a serious miracle. Anyway, that's by the by. But yeah, it really affects the voice, COVID, and the exhaustion levels, which affects the voice. Yeah, singing lessons completely changed for people after they have COVID. I've found I have to do it in shorter bursts, and they need longer times to rest after. But yeah, so different voice. What Ziza was saying, I completely stand with. You know, you'll be able to feel the difference. But if you are not fully or aware of kinesthetic awareness within your body yet, the different signs, you might feel like your voice is dry after singing. You start clearing your throat more. You might start coughing more. You might feel a little bit of an itch in your throat. And obviously the clear indicator is you might feel pain. Different things that can cause it could be reflux. There are different types of two different types of reflux, and one goes into the larynx, and so that can affect the voice as well. The nasal drip can affect the voice. Having a cold can affect the voice. Yeah, yelling obviously affects the voice. And you will feel a difference. You can feel when it's healthy, and you do feel, like Ziza said, when something's not quite right. And then you start to feel when something hasn't been quite right for a while. And if your voice is still hurting or feeling weird 2 weeks afterwards, that's when you should go and probably get a doctor's referral to see a speech pathologist or a laryngologist or an ENT, an ear, nose and throat specialist, to just get it checked, just to make sure that everything is okay. So yes, someone has their hand up.
Yes, and we're about to go into our breakout rooms. So John, and the Q&A will be after the breakout rooms. Is that okay with you? Yes, we are back. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed your breakout rooms. And we did have an interesting conversation there where we got to talk a little bit about how it can be very disconcerting to listen to ourselves having been recorded, and how it's harder to like our own voices in those situations. So we could talk a little more about that maybe. But also, Carolyn, what happened in your breakout room? Anything to report?
We talked about, well, John was talking about how we need to move with our voice, as, you know, be where we're at and change things to where we're at. And I really loved that. And Harriet was talking about, gosh, Harriet, what were we talking about at the start? Can you say what you were saying?
Well, you said someone prayed for you. We were talking about
yes,
someone else, and this mysterious thing about our connection or lack of connection to each other and something greater than ourselves. We didn't say it that way, but there is that mystery. And if I could carry on that tangent, during COVID, the singing was stopped. You don't want to give your germs to other people or get germs from someone else. And so much group singing that was stopped. There's this performance singing, I mean, globally around the world, South Africa, Republic of Georgia, people sing. And we're not singing, and you wonder if some of the angst that's going on, particularly, I mean, in our country, United States, this, like, if we could just get together, as someone said, it's easier to kind of come together. Well, the best way to get some harmony is through song, perhaps not words.
Yeah.
Anyway,
And we did talk about how singing was a mental health benefit. And Lisa was talking about a situation that had happened in her life. Did you want to talk about that, Lisa, about how that impacted your voice?
Yeah. So years ago, I was in South Florida, and I was feeling pretty like stressed and tight. I went to get a massage, and I would always talk with my massage therapist about what's happening in your life and everything. And I was a caregiver for 2 elderly people. I was having a lot of stress, and I wasn't sleeping well, and just a lot of things happening other than that. And so I was telling her about some stressful situations, and she said, well, did you sit down and talk with the people about this stressful situation? Did you confront it? And I said, no, I just swallowed it. And she said, it's interesting you use that phrase because you're very tight through your throat. And I said, well, I do have a neck injury, so that can explain a lot of it. But I also realized that you can hold that stress, and I was holding it here. So that was very interesting and very telling.
Yeah. I mean, there's phrases, like frog in your throat, being tongue-tied. So those phrases, they're not wrong. Do you know what I mean? It is, sometimes it feels like there's something literally clutching onto the throat or tightening. My one thing I would say is try to notice if something like that is happening and ask yourself, what's really going on with me? It's I think using our voices in emotional situations is one of the most challenging things we could ever do. I know for myself, one of my flatmates that I had taught me so much. She came into the room one day and she said, Aideen, that really here's 2 things, right? First thing she said was, Aideen, when you're cleaning the bathroom, would you mind making sure, she just had this really nice tone to her voice. She was basically telling me that I needed to clean the underside of the toilet seat or something. And I was like, oh, why would I do that? And I was impressed with that. But the more impressive thing was I said something to her one day and she said, Aideen, that hurt my feelings. I was like in shock because I'd never heard anyone say that phrase before, not in real life, maybe on TV or something. And we don't know what words to use to express ourselves if nobody in our life has ever expressed themselves in that way. I'm very impressed that Carolyn's dad was able to do it, because it didn't happen at all in my family. So we need to practice those things sometimes and learn from others and learn from the TV as well, maybe. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Lisa.
Yeah, and learn not to swallow the stress. Get an outlet
Exactly.
for it, whether it's singing or something else. But
There's always
meditation.
someone that you can talk to. There's always someone you can talk to. And by talking it through, you figure it out, I think, as we go along. Chris?
I'm a mental health coach, and there's a resource that I use, and there's a couple of variations of it, but you can Google it. It's called a feelings wheel, and it's this circular wheel, and in the center of it is kind of the main emotions that we have. It's like mad, sad, glad, something else, and each emotion goes out into a pie shape like a pizza. So you start with, like, say if I start with mad may have like frustrated, angry, like all these different hues or flavors of that emotion. And I teach my clients, I'll say, just get out the feelings wheel and write down any emotion that pops up. I did it one time and I had 40 emotions going on, and there's a bunch. And it was a stressful situation that happened, but it was different colors and flavors of different ones. And by practicing that myself, I've gotten to a point where I can get a piece of paper out and rattle off what I'm feeling and know. And it's really helpful just in general for mental health. But I think also I'm going to apply it. I just had the idea. I'm going to apply it to when I'm learning a new song that I write or a cover song. Try to figure out what's the emotion the person's trying to get, or they got across. Like for a cover song, let's say, I'm getting a thumbs up from Carolyn. I'm on the right track. Because that's something I'm working on, is connecting emotion to singing. And when you talked about if you don't have a language to talk about what you're feeling or thinking, then you can't express it. If you don't have, in recovery terms, you talk about you don't know what you don't know. If you don't know it, you can't do it. And someone, a counselor, I think once told me about the feelings wheel, and I was like, this is the most brilliant thing ever, particularly as a guy. Like this was like, oh my gosh, there's this whole world of information available to me. I can, So check it out. Just Google it. It's free.
I love that. I definitely want to check that out. I feel like I need that in the house in general for the family. And another thing I sometimes say to singing, if people are singing students, is when someone actually is able to hold space for the emotion of a song, they're the kinds of singers that people will pay to listen to, because it's almost like, okay, this huge thing, this huge emotion is going on in the song, but you're singing through it in a way that you're still holding space for it. You're not collapsing into a heap. You're not starting to cry yourself. And that's very healing for others. And I think sometimes we need to choose, if we're in a performance, we need to choose songs that we feel we have that sense of presence in, rather than one that's still triggering us. Just for any of the singers out there, I wanted to mention that. John, you had mentioned that you might have something to share. Would you like to share now?
Yes, happy to share. I was just saying in the breakout room, I suppose two aspects really. One, my question when I raised my hand earlier was about age and voice. I might come back to that at the end of this, but just to say that my experience with singing is relatively short, only 6 years, I think. I hadn't sung between being 13 and 50. So a big gap from not singing at all to pretty much singing every day. What I've realized in the last 6 years is that even in that period, my voice has changed dramatically from the first sort of few lessons with Aideen, where I think she and I would privately agree that it was quite painful, but it was more about rehoning the skills I had and also getting in touch with the emotion. But as I've become more comfortable with my voice, I've realized it's changed over the years as well, to the point where since January I've had a consistent head cold, and I'm a little bit frustrated that I can't hit the high notes that I necessarily want. So what I've done is just come to accept that that's where I'm at the moment. Some of the songs I've written, I've perhaps brought down a key or changed the structure of them where I want to find high notes that I can no longer find. I've adapted the needs of the song to the availability of the voice. And I think that's an important thing to say. And I also feel that I listen to so many voices from all around the world. I mentioned someone like Tom Waits, you know, probably smokes 60 cigarettes a day and has this beautiful gravelly voice. You know, I'd kill for a voice like that. But most of our health coaches say, don't do this, don't do that. But it develops a unique sound. And, you know, I think that's the important thing. As a young man, obviously, my voice dropped when I was 13 and I stopped singing because I sounded like a goose. With all that, you know, those hormones flushing through my system. And I said that probably now at my age of 56, the hormones are probably leaving my system and looking for greener pastures. And I have to come to terms with another set of vocal conditions. So I think it's important to accept what we've got somewhere along the line and just focus on the positives that the act of singing gives us, as opposed to necessarily always trying to have the same vocal approach. I also think, you know, having recently trying to set up a concert of an hour of my songs, which is quite unique for me. I've sang 3 songs maximum, and that in an hour, you don't sing the same songs. People would switch off if you sang, you know, 10 songs of the same type. So in an hour, you probably need 6 types of voices anyway, you know, a sweet voice, a low voice, a happy singing voice. You need to get in touch with many emotions. And I think each emotion takes different aspects of your voice as well. So that was it, really, just to adapt to the needs and adapt to what you have.
Thank you so much, John. That's so true. I would also suggest if you've had a head cold for like a number of months, it could actually be more of an allergy. So try an antihistamine that actually could just as an option, you know. Also, you know, Carolyn is a vocal health expert. She might be able to give you some advice. I'm sure Carolyn would be happy to connect with you. Before we finish up, Ziza mentioned something interesting in our breakout room about the science behind why we don't like our own voices in recordings. And I know you might, if you need to leave, that's absolutely fine, because we have used up the full hour allotment. But Ziza, if you have a moment, would you mind mentioning that before we sign off?
Yeah, sure. Of course, some of you have already heard this one, but I think it's important for everyone to be aware of it, that all of us, we all hate the way our voice sounds on recordings when we hear it for the first time. And this happens for one big reason, just because what we hear when we speak or sing is different than what other people hear and what happens on the recordings. It's a scientific explanation for that. What we hear is a combination of 3 different sources of vibrations. It's the sound vibrating in our bones, inside our head and in our ear, and also the outer layer of vibration, the air and everything else. This is what we hear. And sometimes it sounds a little bit deeper in our perception, but everybody else hears our voice without this layer of vibration that happens in our cranium. So this is why when we hear it for the first time, our brain being accustomed with what we normally hear, it has this rejection of, this is not mine. It's the rejection of the unknown. And in time, with a little bit of practice, and of course, as you work on your voice and you get accustomed to it, you start to realize that, hey, this is also mine. It's still my voice. It doesn't sound that bad. And it happened to me. I'm sure it happened to everyone. I couldn't listen to my recordings for years, but you're not alone. It happens to everyone. And it's just a scientific reason for that.
Thank you, Ziza. Carolyn, would you like to say anything quickly before we finish up?
Oh no, I just loved what Ziza was saying. You know, it is, and because we do hear our voice differently to what others hear. I remember I recorded my voice singing something and speaking something, and I listened back and I said, "Oh, I sound really ochre, but I don't sound like that in my head. I really like Aussie." But I never thought I sounded like that in my head. And
you'll have to explain the terminology you're using, Carolyn. So what was that first word? I sound
ochre. Ochre.
What
So
is that?
ochre is very Aussie sounding, like "G'day, mate." you know, colloquialisms, and but the way that you say them, I just didn't realize how Aussie I sounded.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but I apparently sound quite Ocker. So yeah.
We're learning something new now. Never heard that term before. Thank you everybody who's joined today. If you'd like to say anything before we finish up, just unmute, and we'll be finishing up now in a moment. It's been a really interesting conversation, and I really appreciate each of you for being here to have this conversation together. Harriet.
Just thank you. And I'm jumping on another Zoom. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Harriet.
All your
Lisa?
contributions.
Lisa, you want to say something?
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but I noticed before the break, John had shared some links. I was going to copy that. Do they disappear like after we go in the breakout rooms?
Yeah, they can
Yeah, I
do.
forget that happens.
That sometimes happens. John,
Yeah.
if you could put them again in the
They're
chat,
no
or
longer there. If you
actually
don't mind.
send it by email, I will make sure that everybody who attended
There you
today
go.
gets those links as well, John.
And thank you,
there's a couple of
everyone.
interesting resources. I mean, even Chris mentioned the Feelings Wheel and a book called The Language of Emotions by someone called McLaren. So any resources that you have.
Put that in the email too.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Thank
John,
you.
we'd love to hear some of your music. John has more
yes.
than one album out at this point, I think.
Oh, nice. Oh, can I share one more thing?
Sure.
So this is to Chris. I was traveling yesterday, like 3.5-hour drive to come down here for a family event. And I got in 3 traffic jams at the least. And I swear, I just thought of your song the whole time. I'm like, I wish I could remember all the words to that song because it seemed so appropriate. But anyway, I thought of you.
I was up until 3 a.m. recording that song last night. Actually, it's funny you say that, but thank you.
Yeah, Lisa's referring to a song Chris sang at an open mic that we had a couple of weeks ago, and it's a song about the people that you see when you're in a traffic jam. Great. And John?
Yeah, I was just going to say that if ever I'm stuck in a traffic jam, I always visualize the opening scene from La La Land. Get up and have a sing and the dance, and just go with it.
Perfect. Well, look, yes, we all have to have strategies how to cope with life, and singing is one of the best strategies in life. And I thank you all for being here. And we will be having another voice and song session again next month at a different time to try and accommodate people at different time zones. And this will be up on YouTube very soon as well, if you'd like to share it with any family or friends. Thank you all.